Okay, so we're Colossians 1:15-23. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant.
Thank you so much, Susie. Keep that open in front of you. We're going to be looking through this passage this morning in about 3 different slots. My name's Richard. I'm one of the pastors here, and if I've not met you, please come and say hi afterwards. Look, whatever sport you enjoy watching or playing, we all love it, don't we, when a game or a match or a race is really close. It makes it worth watching, doesn't it? We love a football game where there are closely matched teams. We love a tennis match where it goes down to the last game. We love a race that's a photo finish. And the same is true of family games, isn't it? Whether it's Jenga, whether it's Catan, whether it's Monopoly, whether it's chess, whatever it is. Even Connect 4 can be fun, actually, can't it? If it's really close. Sometimes, however, it is embarrassingly obvious, isn't it? Who is better and who is greater and who deserves to be in first place. And we saw a bit of an example of that just now, didn't we? Finn is clearly much better than AJ at table tennis. Sorry, AJ, but he is. And look, in Colossians chapter 1, Paul says something similar about Jesus. Paul shows us here why Jesus is greater than any other, why we can be sure that he will always win, and why he deserves first place in our hearts and in our lives. And the first reason that Jesus is greater than any other is because he has first place in creation. So look at verse 15. Paul says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So the Bible says that God is a spirit. That means he's invisible. But here, Paul says Jesus is the image of God. Jesus shows us what God is like because he's God with us. Now, my wife Carolyn isn't here today. She's running the Women's Weekend away, and so you can't see her. She's invisible to us. I could tell you about how wonderful she is, and maybe you believe me, but if you come next Sunday, you can meet her in person because she'll be here in person. You can see for yourself how wonderful she is. And it's a bit like that with Jesus. When we look at Jesus, we see what God is like because he's God with us in person, in the flesh. Later on in verse 19, Paul says that all God's fullness dwells in Jesus, which is really a different way of saying exactly the same thing. As well as being fully human, Jesus is fully God. So when we look at Jesus, we see what God is like. because he's God come in the flesh. And that is why Jesus is greater than any other. It's also why Paul says that Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. This is just another way of saying that Jesus is the greatest person in the universe, greater than any other. When it comes to creation, Jesus stands on the top step of the podium. He's head and shoulders above anyone else. He's the undisputed champion. He's the top of the league. He's in pole position. He's way out in front. He's in the gold medal position. He's first and foremost, before anyone, above anyone, better than anyone else. In the Bible, the firstborn son had first place in the family because they would inherit their father's role as head of the family. And we still see something similar to that in royal families today, don't we? So Prince William is heir to the throne. He will become king and head of the royal family when his father dies. He has a special place of honor, therefore, in the family. And that's how it was in every family in ancient times. The firstborn son had a special place of honor in the family as the future head of the family. And Paul says when it comes to creation, that's true of Jesus. He is in first place when it comes to creation. He deserves the greatest honor, the greatest glory. And the next few verses, verses 16 and 17, tell us why. Because in him, in Jesus, all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What Paul says there is that Jesus has first place over creation for 4 reasons. Because everything in creation was made by him, is kept going by him, belongs to him, and will one day be restored by him. Paul says everything was created through Jesus and for Jesus, and in Jesus everything holds together. So without Jesus there would be no sun or stars, there would be no planets or people, there will be no trees or seas. There will be no mountains or molehills. There will be no cows or cats. There will be no lions or lizards. There will be no bats or birds. There will be no fish or flamingos. Without Jesus, there will be nothing at all. There will be no one in charge of creation. There will be no one to thank for creation. There will be no one who will one day restore creation. Jesus is greater than any other because as the Lord of creation, he has first place in creation. He's before all others. He is the one in first place. So look, as well as having first place in creation, Paul also says in this passage that Jesus has first place in the church. Let me ask you a question. How does your foot know that you want to kick a football? How does your hand know that you want to draw a picture? Turn to your neighbour and have a chat about that for 30 seconds. All right, shout out the answer. Okay, various answers came out there. The right answer is because your head tells them what to do. Your head is in charge of your body. So if you want to kick a football, your head tells your foot to aim at a ball and then to kick it in the goal or to pass it to someone. If you want to draw a picture, your head tells your hand to pick up a pencil and then to start drawing on a bit of paper, and maybe it will look something like a house or a car or a person, maybe. Your head controls everything that you do because your head is in charge of your body. Without our heads, we will be clueless and we will be powerless and in a right mess, as we have just seen an example of there. And Paul says it's the same when it comes to Christians. For us as Christians, without Jesus, we are clueless and we are powerless because Jesus is the head of the church. He is the one who's in control. Listen to how Paul puts it in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. He says this: And he, Jesus, is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, Paul describes Jesus again there as the firstborn, but this time he's talking about the place that Jesus has in the church. Jesus is number one when it comes to creation. He's also number one when it comes to the church. Because like creation, the church wouldn't exist without Jesus. Unless Jesus had come and died and risen again, no one could have their sins forgiven. No one could be friends with God. There'd be no good news for us to share with other people. The church wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here without Jesus, which is why he is the head of the church and he's the one in charge. All of which means we need to listen and obey Jesus. If your feet didn't do what your head told them to do, you couldn't walk anywhere. And in the same way, unless we do what our head, Jesus, tells us to do, then we won't be able to walk the way that we should as his followers. And we hear what Jesus wants us to do when we listen to what he says in the Bible. Children, this is why your young church teachers work so hard to teach you the Bible in your young church groups. Adults, that's why we spend so much time looking at the Bible on Sundays when we gather and in growth groups and in other contexts. Because as a church body, we need to listen to our head's instructions so that we know what to do. Jesus is our head, so he's the only one who is the right to tell us what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. As our head, Jesus has the right to tell us what to believe and how to live. And so we need to listen to him by reading his word, by listening carefully when parents or teachers or friends or church leaders try and teach it to us. Because if we don't obey our head, we'll be in a right mess, as we just saw. So look, we've seen Jesus' first place in creation. We've seen that he's first place in the church. But so what? So what? What does that mean for us now? Well, Paul tells us at the end of verse 18. Let me read that verse to you. He says, Jesus is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. Or as another Bible translation puts it, so that Jesus might have first place in everything. You see, if Jesus has first place in creation and he has first place in the church, he should also have first place in our lives. The problem is, he often doesn't have the first place in our lives. And the reason for that is because of sin. Sin is when we put ourselves first on the top of the podium and push Jesus off. Sin is when we do what we want to do, what we think's right, rather than what Jesus says that's right. Sin is when we cheat Jesus out of the first place he deserves in our lives. But the Bible says that when we put ourselves in first place, we end up in last place. We end up losing out. Because as anyone who does any kind of sport knows, there's always a penalty for cheating. We just saw that, didn't we? If you cheat, you get disqualified. I hope you didn't feel sorry for Owen. I hope you didn't, because actually he was disqualified because he cheated. And if you break the rules, you cheat, you get disqualified. And the same is true when we cheat Jesus of the honor he deserves in our lives. We get disqualified by God. Paul talks about that in verse 21. He reminds the Christians of what they used to be. They used to be, he said, enemies of God because of their sin. But when they made Jesus Lord of their lives, when they put him in first place, their friendship with God was restored. Listen to what he says in verse 21. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Now, look, the word that Paul uses in those verses to describe the difference Jesus makes is reconciled. A bit earlier in verse 20, Paul says Jesus made peace through his blood shed on the cross. And it's through the cross that things are made right. On the cross, Jesus died and then he rose again for losers like us so that we might become winners as we put our trust in his victory over sin and death. And look, this is why Jesus is greater than any other. This is why he deserves to have first place in our lives. Jesus deserves to have that first place in our hearts and in our lives because he died and because he rose again so that we might not be disqualified by God, even though we've sinned, but instead we might be forgiven and made friends with God. Jesus deserves to be number one in our lives because he made it possible for enemies of God like us to have peace with God. So my question is this: is Jesus number one in your life? Is he first place in your life? If he is, it will be obvious. It will make a difference to the way that you live, to what you say, to what you love most, to how you spend your time or your money, to the decisions that you make. If Jesus is in first place, it will be obvious. It will make a difference. So let me ask you, have you put your trust in Jesus today? Have you put your trust in Jesus for the first time? Maybe do that today. And if you have, listen to him and then live with him as number one.